You walked into a room and forgot why you were there. Not unusual, that happens to everyone. But then it happened again, and then you were mid-sentence and the word just wasn't there. A simple word, a word you've used 1,000 times. And you stood there reaching for it, and it wouldn't come. And somewhere in that moment, or maybe later, lying in bed that night, a thought arrived that you haven't quite been able to put down. What if this isn't just stress? What if something is actually wrong? You haven't said it out loud, maybe. It feels too frightening to say. But the question is there. And if you're over 50, you know exactly what the question is really asking. Is this how it starts? Here's what I want you to know before we go any further. The fear you just recognized is one of the most common and most quietly carried fears among people in their 50s and 60s. You are not alone in it, and you are not wrong to take it seriously. But here's what the research actually shows, and this is why this investigation matters. The most common cause of memory problems, cognitive fog, and word-finding difficulty in people over 50 is not early dementia. It is something else entirely. Something measurable, something documented, and in most cases, something that can be addressed. That's what we're going to investigate today. Let's start with why this question is so hard to sit with. Alzheimer's disease affects approximately 6.7 million Americans over 65. By 2050, that number is projected to nearly double. The awareness of this reality is not paranoia, it is informed. People over 50 are not imagining a threat. The threat is real. But awareness without investigation creates a specific kind of suffering. The assumption that every moment of forgetfulness, every lost word, every foggy afternoon is a warning sign. And that assumption, widespread, understandable, and largely incorrect, is causing unnecessary fear in millions of people who are experiencing something very different. The research is clear on this point. Cognitive fog, memory difficulties, and word-finding problems that emerge gradually in midlife, particularly in the absence of significant personality changes, dramatic functional decline, or specific types of memory loss, are far more commonly explained by one biological mechanism than by early neurodegenerative disease. That mechanism has a name, and understanding it changes everything. The hippocampus is a small, seahorse-shaped structure deep in the brain's medial temporal lobe. It is, in the most direct sense, the brain's memory center, the primary site where short-term memories are consolidated into long-term storage, and where spatial and contextual memory is processed. It is also one of the most cortisol-sensitive regions in the entire brain. The hippocampus is densely packed with glucocorticoid receptors, the receptors that respond to cortisol. In acute stress, this is functional. Cortisol temporarily sharpens attention and encodes emotionally significant memories. That is good design. But here is where the investigation gets important. Under conditions of chronic, sustained cortisol elevation, the kind that accumulates quietly over years of low-grade stress, disrupted sleep, and ongoing worry, the hippocampus does not just respond, it changes. Research by neuroscientist Bruce McEwen at Rockefeller University documented that chronic cortisol exposure causes dendritic atrophy in hippocampal neurons. The branches that connect brain cells begin to retract. The cells do not die immediately, but their ability to communicate with each other deteriorates. Because the hippocampus is where memory consolidation happens, that deterioration produces a very specific set of symptoms. Difficulty forming new memories, trouble retrieving words and names, losing track of why you entered a room, a sense that the mind is slower, foggier, less sharp than it used to be. These are not the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. They are the symptoms of a cortisol-stressed hippocampus. The distinction matters enormously. But here is where the investigation takes a turn that most people don't expect. Because what Bruce discovered wasn't just alarming, It was, in a specific and measurable way, hopeful. The most significant finding in this body of research is not that cortisol damages the hippocampus. It's what happens when the cortisol load is reduced. In a landmark series of studies, Bruce and his colleagues found that hippocampal dendrites, the neuronal branches that had atrophied under chronic cortisol exposure, were capable of regrowth when the stressor was removed and conditions changed. The brain did not simply accept the damage as permanent. It attempted to repair. This is what the research community calls neuroplasticity. In the context of stress recovery, the hippocampus, it turns out, is one of the few regions of the brain where new neurons can actually be generated in adult life, a process called neurogenesis. And chronic cortisol suppresses that neurogenesis. When cortisol normalizes, neurogenesis can resume. This finding doesn't mean every case of cognitive difficulty is reversible, or that the effects of decades of stress disappear quickly. It means that the biological system is not a one-way door. It has a capacity for recovery that most people, in their fear about cognitive decline, have never been told about. There is one distinction in this investigation that needs to be stated clearly, because it matters both clinically and personally. The cognitive symptoms driven by chronic cortisol and hippocampal stress tend to look like this: difficulty remembering recent events, trouble finding specific words, inconsistent focus, mental fatigue, a general sense of fog. These symptoms fluctuate. They are worse when sleep is poor. They tend to improve during low-stress periods. The person experiencing them is usually aware that something feels off, which is itself a meaningful signal. Early Alzheimer's disease looks different. The memory loss tends to involve getting lost in familiar environments, repeatedly asking the same question within minutes, significant personality or behavioral changes, and, crucially, impaired judgment and functional decline that progresses consistently, regardless of sleep, stress, or daily variation. If what you are experiencing fluctuates, if it is worse after a poor night of sleep and better after a calm week, the research suggests you are very likely looking at a cortisol and sleep problem, not a neurodegenerative one. That does not mean you should not speak with a physician. You should. A proper evaluation can rule out other causes and give you real information rather than quiet fear. But the research is clear that what most people in midlife are experiencing cognitively is not the beginning of dementia. It is the accumulation of chronic stress, compounded by the specific neurological vulnerability of the hippocampus, compounded by insufficient sleep. This is the piece of the investigation that most directly connects to what you can do. Sleep is not a passive state. During sleep, specifically during slow-wave deep sleep stages, the brain runs what researchers now call the glymphatic system, a waste clearance mechanism that flushes metabolic byproducts from the brain's interstitial spaces. Among the substances cleared by this system are beta-amyloid proteins, the same proteins associated with plaque accumulation in Alzheimer's disease. Sleep deprivation does not just create fatigue. It impairs glymphatic clearance, and impaired clearance allows metabolic waste to accumulate in the brain overnight. In the short term, this produces the cognitive fog that follows a poor night of sleep. Over years, the research suggests it may contribute to conditions far more serious. Matthew Walker at the University of California, Berkeley, documented this connection extensively. Matthew's research showed that a single night of sleep deprivation produced a measurable increase in beta-amyloid accumulation in the brain, particularly in the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex. The single most protective thing you can do for your cognitive health after 50 is protect your sleep. There is something worth naming directly here because it sits in the room when we talk about dementia fear and we rarely acknowledge it. The fear of losing your mind, of losing the ability to recognize the people you love, to know who you are, to participate in your own life, is one of the deepest fears available to a human being. It touches something more than physical health. It touches identity. It touches the question of whether the person you are will still be there. And for many Christians, this fear carries an additional weight, a quiet, unspoken worry that cognitive struggle reflects some kind of spiritual diminishment, that a foggy mind is somehow a faithless one. The research we have investigated today has nothing to say against faith. It says, in precise biological language, that your brain has been under pressure, that the pressure has a mechanism, that the mechanism can be interrupted, and that the same body God designed, with its remarkable capacity for recovery, for neurogenesis, for the restoration of what chronic stress has worn down, is the same body He is present in today. The mind that is foggy is not a faithless mind. It is a tired one, and tired things can rest. Sleep is the single most protective factor for your memory and cognitive health after 50. The research on this is not ambiguous. If sleep is the variable that needs addressing, if nighttime anxiety, racing thoughts, or fragmented rest are part of your experience, the Night Peace Framework was built specifically for that problem. It is in the description below. It may be the most important thing you do for your brain this week.